Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence. I'm Rachel Cronenfeld, the product manager at LifeRaft and your host. Our guest today is Kara Gronborg, who's a manager and global intelligence and threat analyst at the NFL. She spends every day protecting events, venues, and key VIPs, which is our topic for today. So, Kara, welcome, and can you start by telling us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me today. So I've been with the NFL team for about 5.5 years so far, from the very beginning of their intelligence program. I originally started as a contractor and then recently switched over to full-time NFL employee. Through my position here, I help manage the day-to-day operations of our intelligence team and also have led numerous events for intelligence planning, like the last couple Super Bowls.
And I imagine, Super Bowl, big event day, your team is probably all hands on and there's a clear plan of action. But I have a feeling that your team does not get to rest in the off season. So can you tell me a bit about some of NFL's best practices to build that solid foundation for threat monitoring in the off season leading up to the big day?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do say in the GSOC that we don't really get an off season. We're kind of on all the time. But the off season is, when we're really kind of evaluating the threats that we saw over the last season to make sure that our monitoring priorities are set up for our season going forward and that our tools are also prepared to capture the threats that we're looking for. So really, the evaluation period and planning is very important as we lead up into the season, whether that be through standard operating procedure creation or really fine tuning our keyword queries and what we're looking for online to make sure that we're capturing the information that we need to make sure that, we're seeing the threats that may impact our game days and our operations so that we're able to, effectively respond to those on game day. So I'd say, the off-season period is when we're really going through that evaluation phase to make sure, we're staying up to date on the current threats and that our tools are collecting what we need them to.
You bring up a great point about having to refine that monitoring collection. It's probably very rare that you set up a foundation to monitor and get it right the first time. That refinement piece is, I think, really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about the NFL, a lot of people are talking about the NFL every day. And so when you're thinking about how that is for monitoring, it's really, having to go through a lot of different reports and find the ones that are most valuable to us. And so, having that keyword refinement and really getting down to kind of the nitty gritty of what we're actually concerned with and what we're actually looking for is very, very important to understand, what we're going to be seeing on game day so that we're not, weeding through tons and tons of posts that are just irrelevant to us. So we really like to, fine tune and understand like how our fans and our consumers are talking about the game itself so that we make sure we're looking at like colloquialisms or nicknames or how other people are talking about them, because if we are getting a threat against an asset or personnel, they're typically going to be using those phrases rather than what we think they're going to be using. So I think that's an important step as well.
Absolutely, and that's a great tip for everybody listening. So it sounds like that the volume of all the chatter surrounding the sports industry in general is definitely a challenge to sift through. What are some of the other unique security challenges that you face in the sports industry, and any other tips for mitigating those other challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever, the OSINT world or the open source world or, social media monitoring really presents itself into the physical footprint as well. So, what we're seeing online really, going into physical concerns for our stadiums and for our personnel. So, when you're talking about digital exhaust and what information is available about someone online really impacting their physical security, I think is unique and hugely important because, we're dealing with a lot of people that are very well known and might have a lot of their personal information online. And, what does that mean for their physical security in person, whether it's at a game or in their day to day? There's a lot of information that, someone could actually target them in real life. And so I think that that's really important to kind of understand a digital footprint, and then also, assist with monitoring for people discussing this digital footprint. So, looking for, doxing attempts or individuals' addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, whatever it might be being posted online, so that, we can help to potentially, clear this information so that they're, not getting targeted in the physical, security realm as well.
That's a lot of different incidents that you have to look into, whether it's for a high profile individual or someone else. How do you prioritize, what gets looked at first and who gets that additional physical security? It sounds like just a lot to triage and prioritize.
So I think we definitely look at, the potential timeliness for the threat and someone's ability to act. But that being said, we never want to judge the credibility of something that's posted online just because we're not addressing these people in person. So it's really important to bring in our law enforcement partners and some of our security investigators to really, kind of judge that credibility of a threat, since, we're not, in person, we only see their online footprint, and, anything could potentially, turn into a real threat. And so, we address, everything as a very serious threat, and something that, we're looking into, and referring to law enforcement to kind of make those additional judgments on, potential credibility.
Would you say you have law enforcement involved in every single incident that occurs?
I wouldn't say necessarily every single incident, but we have great, partnerships with our law enforcement across the country that are, in our NFL host cities, and so it's a huge piece of our puzzle to involve them in our investigations as well, to make sure that, we are taking every threat seriously.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned, having local law enforcement across all those different areas. I guess I see that as a challenge too when you're monitoring things online or you get a tip. How do you know where that person or group, that's making a threat in this scenario, where they're located? Geospatial intelligence is becoming more and more difficult. How big of a role does that play? And then what are the challenges surrounding geospatial intelligence?
So I would say we're doing, open source investigations on each individual that will threaten a player or personnel or an asset, to try and identify that information about them. So it all depends on their publicly available information on their profiles, which some can be, very limited. But, as far as investigations go, we're exhausting, every avenue possible in order to be able to identify these individuals. And then, if there is, other considerations, that's, when we do pass to law enforcement to assist with potential, subpoenas or what it might be, to, further try to identify who these individuals might be.
So that's interesting that you have to do some sort of investigation into every, initial threat that comes NFL's way. So it sounds like you're not able to get, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not able to get solid geolocation based information from that initial point of when someone says something. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends. I would say that it's based on an individual's geotagging on their profiles, which a lot of people do not have geolocation services turned on for their profiles. So it really depends on their publicly available information and us kind of rooting through their profiles in different posts to attempt to identify where they may be.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's becoming more and more difficult, but sometimes people still will tag locations and have those on where you be able to identify something like that more easily than having to do a whole investigation. And like you said, it really just depends. So, uh, planning for those incidents, how important would you say in the grand scheme of things that planning ahead is in comparison to reacting to what happens?
Well, I mean, I think planning ahead is arguably probably the most important part of being able to react to anything. We have to have the correct queries set up in order for us to be able to find things to react to. So, we really need to take the planning process seriously and making sure that we're fine tuning, our search keywords, so that they're really, getting us what we're looking for, so that we have something to react to, or else, we don't really know what's out there. You don't know what you don't know, and so without proper planning, your unknowns are vastly greater.
Absolutely. Would you say that planning ahead ends up kind of speeding up the process when things do happen as to how you're going to react because you have that plan? Like, are you able to give an example maybe of when you had a plan in place, something happened, and because that plan was there, you were able to cut down on time that during the investigation or whatever you had to look into that you probably wouldn't have been able to do if you did not plan ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think SOPs and standard operating procedures are arguably the most important part of our job, so that it is repeatable process, and that we're prepared to act in whatever situation may come. And so an example of this is during a planning trip for the Las Vegas Super Bowl, there was an active shooter situation at UNLV, where we were having some different tours for use for Super Bowl. And, during that process, we have, things in place for us to notify and outreach to staff to ensure that they're, safe and accounted for, and if they need any assistance. And so because we had that plan in place for emergency communications and, those groups created, we were able to, act very quickly to notify staff, that it happened, and, understand that nobody was affected, very quickly.
That's awesome. And that's a great, powerful example because it involved threats to people's lives, not necessarily threats to something else. So that's a really highly important. So switching gears a little bit, this might be more of a cybersecurity question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you have any tips for measures that somebody could take to address security risks and vulnerabilities with things like the Internet of Things and smart technologies today, probably which a lot of are coming into your events and venues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about establishing really like a common operating picture that all of these, technologies can speak to, so that you have, a full understanding of your threat landscape. So if you have a variety of tools, whether that be, an OSINT monitoring tool or, camera systems, that they're all, within one system, one common operating system that anyone, can go into and be able to identify a threat and then be able to, switch over to a camera feed to understand where that threat might be happening. So I think that that's a key piece in all of the technologies that are coming out, is really, their integration and they're speaking to each other, so that you can effectively, do your job quickly, and that you have, all of your technology in one place.
Yeah, integration is absolutely necessary today, like you said, to bring in information from all those different places. I'm sure you still need to collaborate as well with the other departments. So outside of the intelligence team that you work with as a core, what would you say are like other departments that you have like on speed dial all the time to be working with, whether it's a phone conversation or that you frequently have meetings with? Just curious.
Well, I would say, we're definitely, our security team is pretty large, and our investigators. So a lot of the stuff we can, do internally, but as part of that process, also, looping in our integrity team. We have an integrity team that deals with, gaming integrity related issues as part of our security team that we're working with regularly. Our legal department for investigative purposes are typically looped in, and they have, investigative piece as well that, we work with pretty regularly. And so I'd say those are pretty much our main ones. HR definitely is a big one as well, particularly for, insider threat considerations or, any potential employee issues that we might see, working with them pretty heavily too.
That makes sense. And an integrity department I have not heard of very often, so maybe that's a bit unique to sports industry or like a high profile industry, such as sports.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely up and coming with the prevalence of sports betting. Not my area of expertise, I would say, but we work with them, regularly on investigations.
That's interesting. Doesn't make sense. Uh, so switching gears a bit, how do you remain current and nimble in the ever-changing threat landscape? You just mentioned things like sports betting. There could be new threats associated with that now as that continues to grow. So, like, how do you keep up with all these things?
I would say, just being adaptable is the biggest part, and understanding that what works for you today may not work tomorrow. So understanding that new technologies may come on the scene, and you have to understand that it's whatever fits best for your organization and your needs and what your collection is. And so understanding and being adaptable to those changing technologies and the changing landscape is the most important part. You don't want to get stuck in your ways and say, well, this is the way it's always been done. Well, the threat landscape is changing, so you have to change with it, or else you'll be very outdated in what you're doing and likely miss things because of that.
Yeah, that is very true, and I know I've seen and felt that when I talk to other organizations, can very clearly tell the ones that are keeping up and swapping out their tools or finding new ways to do things when something changes, versus some that get a little overwhelmed and lost in it. So I think it's yeah, you have to keep up, otherwise, like you said, things are going to start getting missed, and technology is going to just move way ahead faster than you're moving. So, what are trends that you're seeing as far as the way technology is changing and trends are changing? What are you seeing as far as shaping the future of threat intelligence and cybersecurity in the sports industry?
Well, I think, AI is always the hot topic, and particularly in, tools related to OSINT searching and cybersecurity. And, I think that these tools do greatly increase, our ability to search for things, on the internet. We're constantly able to find more and look at other, alternative social media sites because of some of the AI tools that are out there. So, it's really expands, our ability to monitor. I think, that being said, it's still very important to have that analyst also vetting the AI tools to make sure that they're as valuable as they can be for us, because at the end of the day we have to teach them to look for what we need. So I think that partnership between emerging technology and also an analytic person looking at the results is kind of the most important part of our job, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely still need the analyst in combination with AI. You mentioned AI increases your ability to monitor sources that you weren't necessarily able to do before. Do you have another example for our listeners of that you could share of how NFL has implemented AI and how it's been helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a lot of our monitoring tools, AI is kind of the background of those tools and how they collect. And so, we're feeding it, our priorities for incidents that happen around our office buildings, let's say. So, if we're looking for kind of any disruption around our office in New York, for example, it's able to pull in, a protest that might be, blocking a roadway that we can notify staff about that's coming into the office to avoid the area, to make sure that they're able to, transit into the office safely. So I would say that's kind of a big part of our day to day, and being able to kind of find those, more minute things on the internet, like a protest, and pull it in so that we can, notify staff, and they can keep themselves safe on the way into work.
Yep, that definitely makes sense, and I think that AI has in a way been helping security teams do that piece for a while, really, and it's only continuing to develop. All right, so we're going to move on to what we call our rapid fire questions. So buckle up, and I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions about some opinions that you might have, some tips for our listeners. So, what is your go-to OSINT related book?
I think How Spies Think by David Omand is a great book.
I have not heard of that book. Do you mind sharing a bit about it?
Yeah, so it really kind of looks into judging, fact versus fiction, and I think that that's a very important part of, OSINT monitoring and intelligence is there's a lot of misinformation out there and there's just a lot of information. So, being able to determine, the real stuff from the potential fake stuff, and then also, understanding how that applies to you and your organization and what may be important to you might not be important to something else. So I think it's a great lesson to learn for Intel analysts.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I'm definitely going to have to read that. Very relevant today for sure. What's a common misconception about security in professional sports?
I think that it's just, guards, gates, and guns, that it's only, physical security at this point. But, I think the intelligence specific sector in sports is rapidly growing, particularly because of how important it is in keeping, our people and our assets safe. And so I think that that's a misconception that, we don't exist, basically. So.
Yeah, and that's surprising actually, that people are still thinking that in the sports industry. I know that NFL has done a wonderful job really building up your GSOC as well. So definitely exists. You have a whole army of people that are working to keep people safe online for sure. Um, do you think that, threats against sports organizations are increasing or decreasing?
I think definitely increasing. I think, every day the internet expands in, different places and available social media for, people to talk on. And so I think that just also expands, our threats and our potential threats that we have to monitor for.
Absolutely. And just curious, does NFL track at all, what are physical threats coming in versus online threats? And do you guys have any stats as to like what that difference looks like?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's like online versus physical because there's kind of a nexus to both. Regardless of what the threat is, because an online threat could turn physical very quickly. So we kind of grouped into one. I would say we don't necessarily separate them, but we definitely have, a lot of threats to look into.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And can you name one key proactive security measure every sports organization should implement?
I think just the planning process and relationship building, not only, amongst your own internal teams, but also with external resources such as your law enforcement partners and your other corporate GSOC partners. That's extremely important to us and the way that we operate, particularly for, special events. And bringing those groups together because we're all looking at the same things but from a slightly different lens, so the ability for us to work together to combat some of these threats is really important, and us understanding the full landscape. And it also just increases as a force multiplier for our intel operations when you have that many people kind of invested together.
And I love the point you mentioned about you're all looking at similar things, so it's just a matter of coming together and sharing that information, like you said, to get the full picture. So important. If all of these different groups were working in silos and not sharing information with each other, then you don't get that full picture. You miss things, and I'm sure some team like the NFL, would be worse off missing things. So that's great that you do that, and everyone else should do that also. Well, that's all I have for today. So thanks so much, Kara, for coming on with us. And it's really interesting insights into the NFL day to day, on season and off season.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.